Welcome to Family Betrayal Revenge. Stay tuned. Have a fun time and let's talk in the comment. Let's go!
You have 5 minutes to sign over your hotel empire, or I make the call to have you involuntarily committed for a mental breakdown. My father didn't blink as he threatened to lock me away just to steal my $580 million company. He thought he held a gun to my head. He didn't realize I was holding the bullets. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm Morgan Hayes, and 4 hours before my father threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked in a psychiatric facility so he could steal my $580 million hospitality empire, I was standing in my corner office in Boston watching the news ticker run my company's name across the bottom of the screen. Hayes Hospitality Group valued at $580 million following successful acquisition of 3 luxury properties in the Northeast Corridor. I was 29 years old, and I'd spent the last 5 years clawing my way up from absolutely nothing to build this view. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that finally knew my name. Mahogany desk that cost more than the first car I'd ever owned. Original artwork on the walls from galleries that wouldn't have let me through the door 6 years ago. Everything in that office was mine, earned, built, fought for with my bare hands, and more sleepless nights than I could count. And then my phone buzzed, vibrated against the polished wood surface with a sound that made my stomach drop before I even looked at the screen, because I knew that specific pattern of buzz, that particular weight of interruption, meant family, meant problems, meant Edward Hayes was about to remind me that no matter how successful I became, he still thought he owned me. The text wasn't from Edward directly. It was from my younger brother Nathan, the only person still living in that massive estate who hadn't completely sold his soul. Family dinner, 7 p.m., urgent. Dad says don't be late. And I stared at those words, at the casual command disguised as an invitation, at the assumption that I would drop everything and come running the moment Edward snapped his fingers. And part of me, the part that still remembered being 23 and desperate for his approval, wanted to delete the message, wanted to pretend I hadn't seen it, wanted to protect the peace I'd built by staying as far away from that family as possible. But another part of me, the part that had learned to read between lines and see traps before they closed, recognized something in Nathan's phrasing. The word urgent wasn't Nathan's vocabulary. That was Edward's word, Edward's tone, which meant Nathan was transcribing, was being used as a messenger, was probably standing in Edward's study right now while Edward dictated exactly what to send. I picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to respond at all, whether to give Edward the satisfaction of knowing his summons had reached me, whether to play whatever game he was setting up. And that's when I remembered the notification I'd received 2 days ago through my encrypted messaging app, the one Nathan and I used to communicate when we didn't want Edward monitoring our conversations. Because Edward monitored everything, controlled everything, knew everything that happened under his roof, and thought his reach extended far beyond those walls into the lives of children who'd legally been adults for years. 2 days ago, Nathan had sent me a photo, just a photo, no explanation, no context, just an image of a crumpled document he'd apparently fished out of Edward's trash can in the library. I'd had to zoom in to read it, had to piece together what I was seeing through the wrinkles and shadows, and when I finally understood what I was looking at, my heart had started racing. Not with fear, but with that cold, calculating excitement that comes when you realize your enemy has just revealed a fatal weakness. It was a final notice of default from a private equity firm called Cerberus Capital, specialized in high-risk bridge loans, basically legalized loan sharks for desperate rich people who'd run out of legitimate borrowing options. And the numbers were what made my pulse spike. $28 million in toxic loans, personally guaranteed by Edward Hayes, due in full within 48 hours, or the collateral would be seized. The collateral being 51% of his voting shares in Hayes Financial Holdings, the company he'd built his entire identity around, the company he'd inherited from his father and had spent 40 years pretending he'd built himself. I'd stared at that photo for 10 minutes trying to process what it meant. Edward Hayes, the man who'd thrown me out of his house 5 years ago for marrying someone he deemed beneath our family, the man who'd cut me off from my trust fund, my health insurance, my entire support system because I'd chosen love over his approval, the man who'd told me I'd come crawling back within 6 months begging for forgiveness. That man was drowning in debt, was facing financial ruin, was 48 hours away from losing everything he'd spent his life pretending to control, and now he was calling me to dinner, urgent, don't be late, because he'd seen my company's valuation on the news, had watched me succeed spectacularly without him, and suddenly remembered he had a daughter, suddenly decided that blood mattered, suddenly wanted to reconnect, except I knew Edward Hayes, knew him better than he'd ever bothered to know me. And I knew this wasn't about reconnection, this was about extraction. He saw me as a life raft, as emergency capital, as the solution to a problem he'd created and was too proud to solve on his own terms. He thought he was summoning me to manipulate me into a bailout, thought he could use guilt or family obligation or some combination of both to make me write a check, thought I was still the scared 23-year-old he'd terrorized into submission for most of my childhood. He had no idea who was actually coming to dinner, had no idea what I'd become in the 5 years since he'd locked the iron gates of his estate in my face and told me I was dead to the Hayes legacy. I remembered that day with perfect clarity, remembered standing outside those gates with Daniel, my husband, the man Edward had called a parasitic draftsman because he was an architect without family money, without connections, without anything except talent and integrity and a genuine love for me. That Edward couldn't understand because he'd never loved anything except power. Daniel had held my hand while Edward stood on the other side of the gate, wouldn't even let us onto the property, wouldn't let me collect my things, just handed me a single suitcase through the bars like I was a prisoner being released, or maybe a prisoner being exiled, and he'd said something I'd never forget, said it loud enough for the staff to hear, loud enough for Nathan to hear from his bedroom window, loud enough to make sure I understood this wasn't a temporary punishment, this was permanent excommunication. You marry that penniless draftsman, and you're choosing poverty, you're choosing to fail, you're choosing to prove to me that you never had what it takes to be a Hayes, and when you come crawling back, and you'll come crawling back, I'll decide whether you've learned your lesson or whether you stay in the gutter where you belong. 5 years. 5 years of him waiting for me to fail, 5 years of him telling people at dinner parties that his daughter had thrown away her future for a man who couldn't afford to buy her the life she deserved, 5 years of him checking my credit reports. Nathan had told me about that. Edward had been monitoring my credit score, watching my bank accounts through some connection he had, literally tracking my financial collapse like it was entertainment, like my poverty was a reality show. He'd greenlit and was waiting to see how it ended. He wanted me to hit rock bottom, wanted me to lose the apartment, wanted me to default on loans, wanted me to break, because in Edward's mind breaking me was the same as teaching me, suffering was education, and my crawling back would be graduation. What Edward didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd stopped paying attention the moment he decided I was a failure, was that hunger is one hell of a motivator, that spite is premium fuel, that every night I'd eaten ramen for dinner while Daniel and I renovated our first property with our own hands, every time we'd chosen between paying rent or buying materials, every morning I'd woken up on a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment that smelled like damp plaster and mold, I'd thought about Edward, about his certainty that I'd fail, about his absolute conviction that I couldn't survive without his money, without his name, without his approval, and I'd used that, had turned his expectations into rocket fuel, had built an entire company on the foundation of proving him wrong. Daniel and I had started small, too small for Edward to notice. We bought a tiny boutique hotel that was barely operational, 8 rooms, outdated decor, in a neighborhood that was just starting to gentrify. We'd paid for it with a combination of Daniel's savings, my final paycheck from the job I'd had before Edward cut me off, and a small business loan that had taken 6 banks to approve because nobody wanted to bet on 2 kids with no collateral. We'd renovated that hotel ourselves, Daniel doing the architectural work, the design, the actual construction, me handling the business side, the marketing, the bookings, the customer service. We'd worked 16-hour days for 2 years straight, had lived in one of the hotel rooms to save money, had eaten meals made from whatever guests left behind or whatever we could afford at the discount grocery store, and slowly, painfully, we'd made it work. We'd filled those 8 rooms, had gotten good reviews, had built a reputation, had saved enough to buy a second property, then a third. Then we'd started attracting investors, real investors who saw potential, who understood hospitality, who believed in our vision, and 5 years later we had 15 properties, $580 million valuation, and a reputation in the industry as the company that understood luxury without pretension, as the place where design met service. where architecture became experience. Edward knew none of this, had paid no attention, had been too busy waiting for my failure to notice my success, until my company's valuation hit the news, until Hayes Hospitality Group became too big to ignore, until suddenly the daughter he'd written off was worth more than he was, and now he wanted dinner. Now he wanted to talk. Now he wanted to reconnect. Except I'd learned something in 5 years away from that family. I'd learned that people like Edward don't change, don't suddenly develop empathy, don't wake up one day and realize they've been cruel. People like Edward just recalculate. They see a new angle, a new opportunity, a new way to use you, and they adjust their approach. They don't apologize for trying to destroy you. They just pretend it never happened and expect you to be grateful they're acknowledging you exist. I didn't call Daniel, didn't tell him where I was going, didn't want to worry him. He knew about the dinner invitation, had seen me staring at my phone, had asked if I was okay, and I'd kissed him and said I was fine, said I just needed to handle some family business, said I'd be home by 9. What I didn't tell him was what I was planning, what I'd already set in motion, what was going to happen at that dinner table. Because Daniel was good, was kind, was the kind of person who believed in redemption and second chances, and I loved that about him. Loved his optimism, but I'd learned a different lesson, had learned that some people don't deserve redemption, don't earn second chances, and sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let them face the consequences of their own choices, without cushioning the fall. I called my lead counsel instead, called him from my office at 3 p.m., 4 hours before the dinner, and I gave him instructions that were clear, specific, and completely ruthless. Buy it, I said, buy the debt. The note that Cerberus Capital is holding on Edward Hayes. Pay whatever premium they want, whatever it takes. I don't care about the cost. I care about the timeline. I need that paper in my name, in my company's name. Before 6 p.m. tonight, before I walk into that house, before I sit down at that table, I need to own my father's debt. Do you understand what I'm asking you to do? And there was a pause on the other end of the line. My counsel was a man named Marcus who'd been with me since the beginning, who'd handled every contract, every acquisition, every legal battle I'd fought to build this company, and he knew me well enough to know that when I used that tone, that particular ice-cold clarity, I wasn't asking, I was commanding, and the command was justified. Marcus asked the obvious question, the one any good lawyer asks, "Are you sure about this, Morgan? This is your father. This is going to burn every bridge. This is nuclear." And I'd laughed, actually laughed, a sound with no humor in it. The bridges are already burned, Marcus. He burned them 5 years ago. He burned them when he told me I'd fail, when he sabotaged Daniel's career, when he made phone calls to every major architecture firm in Boston telling them that if they hired my husband, he'd pull every construction loan his company held with them. He engineered our poverty, Marcus. He didn't just watch us struggle. He created it. He orchestrated it. He sat in his mansion drinking wine that cost more than our monthly rent. And he monitored our credit reports like we were lab rats in an experiment he designed. So no, I'm not worried about bridges. I'm worried about timing. I'm worried about leverage. I'm worried about making sure that when I walk into that dining room tonight, I'm not walking in as his daughter. I'm walking in as his creditor, as the person who holds the paper on his debt, as the only thing standing between him and complete financial collapse. So buy the debt, Marcus, buy it now, buy it fast, and make sure the transfer is recorded before 6 p.m. because I want to own him before he tries to own me. Have you ever been in a position where someone who hurt you, someone who tried to destroy you, suddenly needs your help and doesn't even realize you're the one holding the knife? Let me know where you're watching this from tonight, because I need you to understand what happened next. I need you to understand that this wasn't about revenge. Not exactly. This was about justice. This was about consequences. This was about a man who'd spent 5 years waiting for me to fail, finally learning that I'd succeeded beyond his wildest nightmares. And that success gave me power, real power, the kind of power that could reshape his entire world. And I was about to use it. But first I needed to understand something, needed to confirm something I suspected, needed to hear from his own mouth why he'd done it, why he'd tried so hard to destroy the daughter who'd only ever wanted his approval, because that answer, that confession, would determine exactly how far I was willing to go, how much mercy I was willing to show, and whether Edward Hayes would walk away from this dinner with anything left or whether I was going to take everything, leave him with nothing. Let him feel exactly what he'd tried to make me feel 5 years ago when he'd locked those gates and told me I was dead to the family. Marcus called me back at 5:45 p.m., 15 minutes before I needed to leave for the estate. "The debt is yours," he said, his voice tight with something between admiration and concern. "Cerberus sold it to us for 18 million. They were desperate to offload it. They knew Edward was going to default. They knew they'd never see full repayment. So they took our offer. The transfer is recorded. The paperwork is filed. You are now the sole creditor on a $28 million note. That's due in full in approximately," he paused. "I heard papers rustling. 36 hours, and you hold the collateral agreement, which means you hold his voting shares, which means if he defaults, which he will because he can't possibly raise 28 million in 36 hours, you own controlling interest in Hayes Financial Holdings, you own his company Morgan, you own everything he is," and I closed my eyes. Let that information settle into my bones. Let it become real, become solid. Become the weapon I'd needed without knowing I needed it until the moment presented itself. When I walked out of my office and into the elevator, I checked my reflection in the chrome doors, saw a woman in a tailored suit that cost more than Edward had given me in allowance during my entire childhood, saw someone who looked calm, professional, completely in control, saw no trace of the scared 23-year-old who'd stood outside those gates begging to be let back in. That girl was gone. Had died somewhere between the ramen dinners and the 16-hour workdays, had been replaced by someone harder, smarter, more dangerous. And tonight, I wasn't going home to visit my father, wasn't going to a family reunion, wasn't attending a dinner where I was expected to perform gratitude for being invited back into the fold. Tonight, I was going to visit my debtor, was going to sit across from a man who thought he held all the cards and show him that the deck had been reshuffled, that the game had changed, that the daughter he'd thrown away had come back, not to beg, not to apologize, not to ask for forgiveness, but to collect a debt that had been accruing interest for 5 years, and the interest rate was going to be steep, was going to cost him everything he valued, and I was going to enjoy watching him realize that the biggest mistake of his life wasn't throwing me out, it was teaching me how to survive without him, because survival had made me strong, had made me ruthless, had made me exactly the kind of person who could walk into that house, sit at that table, smile at the man who'd tried to destroy me, and destroy him right back without raising my voice, without losing control, without giving him anything except the truth. And the truth was going to hurt, was going to cut deeper than any insult he'd ever thrown at me, was going to teach him the lesson he should have learned decades ago. That power isn't inherited, it's earned. And tonight, in that dining room, at that table, surrounded by family who'd watched him hurt me and said nothing, I was going to show him exactly what earned power looked like when it finally stopped being merciful. The Hayes estate looked exactly as I remembered it, exactly as it had appeared in my nightmares for 5 years. The iron gates that had been locked in my face, the circular driveway with its perfectly manicured hedges shaped into geometric precision by gardeners who cost more per month than most people's mortgage payments. The house itself rising 3 stories of old money and older cruelty. Georgian architecture that had been in the Hayes family for 4 generations, which Edward loved to remind people about, loved to use as evidence of legacy, of breeding, of superiority, as if living in a house your great-grandfather built made you special, as if inheriting wealth was the same as earning it, as if the address on your driver's license determined your worth as a human being. I pulled up to the gate in my car, a Mercedes S-Class that I'd bought last year after closing a particularly difficult acquisition. Black, sleek, the kind of car that whispered success rather than screaming it, and I watched the security camera swivel to focus on me. Watched the gate begin to open automatically, which meant Nathan had told them I was coming, had added my license plate back to the approved list, had done what he could to make this easier, even though nothing about tonight was going to be easy. I drove slowly up that circular drive, taking in details I'd forgotten. The fountain in the center with its bronze sculptures of Greek gods, the topiary that spelled out Hayes in letters so precise they looked computer-generated, the garage off to the left that held Edward's collection of vintage cars he never drove, just polished and displayed like trophies, evidence of wealth he could afford to lock away. I parked in front of the main entrance, killed the engine, sat for a moment in the silence, my hands on the steering wheel, breathing, centering, preparing myself for what came next, because walking into that house wasn't just walking into a building, it was walking into a battlefield, into a place where I'd been wounded so many times I'd lost count, into a space that held more trauma than comfort, more pain than joy, and I needed to remember that the girl who'd been hurt here was gone, that I was different now, stronger, armored, carrying weapons Edward didn't know existed. The front door opened before I could knock, and my mother stood there, Catherine Hayes, 57 years old and still beautiful in that cold porcelain way that came from excellent genes and expensive maintenance. She was wearing a cream-colored dress that probably cost $5,000, pearls at her throat that had belonged to Edward's mother, hair swept back in a chignon so perfect it looked carved rather than styled, and her face. Her face showed nothing. No happiness to see me. No remorse for what had happened. No acknowledgement that 5 years had passed since I'd stood in this doorway. Just a careful, neutral expression that could have meant anything or nothing. "Morgan," she said, her voice like glass, smooth, cold, reflective. Had recognized somewhere in my mid-20s that Catherine Hayes had never wanted to be a mother, had wanted to be a trophy wife, a society hostess, a woman whose photograph appeared in the right magazines, and children were just another accessory, another way to signal status. And I'd been the wrong kind of accessory, too independent, too questioning, too willing to challenge, while Nathan had been perfect, compliant, easy to control, easy to mold into exactly what they wanted. She stepped aside to let me in, and I crossed the threshold into the foyer that had always felt more like a museum than a home. Marble floors that echoed with every footstep, a chandelier overhead that had been imported from France and cost more than most people's houses, a curved staircase that swept up to the second floor where my old bedroom was, probably empty now. Probably repurposed into a guest room or an office, or maybe just left vacant like a shrine to their disappointment in me. The air smelled the same, some combination of fresh flowers and furniture polish and old money, that particular scent that came from having staff clean everything constantly, from having enough resources that nothing ever got truly dirty, never got lived in, never got comfortable. "Your father is in the dining room," Catherine said, leading me through the house, her heels clicking on the marble. "He's been looking forward to seeing you. And I bet he has, I bet he's been counting down the hours. Calculating exactly what he's going to say, exactly how he's going to manipulate me, exactly which combination of guilt and obligation and family duty will work best. He'd had 5 years to plan this conversation, 5 years to imagine what he'd say when I finally came crawling back. Except I wasn't crawling. I was walking in on my own terms, with my own power, holding cards he didn't know existed. The dining room felt less like a place for family meals and more like a mausoleum where affection went to die. That's what I'd thought the first time Nathan had said it, years ago when we were kids, and the description had stuck because it was perfect. The room was too formal, too large, too carefully decorated to ever feel warm. The table could seat 20 people, but tonight it was set for 4. Crystal glasses catching the light from the chandelier overhead, china so fine you could see through it, silverware that was actual silver, polished to a mirror shine, flowers in the center that had probably been flown in from somewhere exotic that morning. Everything perfect, everything expensive, everything designed to communicate status, to remind anyone who sat at this table that they were in the presence of wealth, of power, of people who mattered. Except I'd learned something important in 5 years away from this table. I'd learned that real power doesn't need crystal glasses. And imported flowers, real power is quiet, is certain, is the kind of thing you carry with you rather than surround yourself with. And tonight I had more power than anyone in this room. I just needed to wait for the right moment to reveal it. Nathan was already seated, my younger brother who was 26 now, who'd grown from a scared teenager into a man who still looked scared. He was wearing a suit, probably because Edward had told him to, probably because dinner at the Hayes estate required formal attire, even though it was just family, even though we weren't entertaining, even though this whole performance was absurd. He looked up when I entered, and his eyes met mine. Just for a second, and I saw it there, the apology, the helplessness, the "I'm sorry I couldn't stop this. I'm sorry you had to come back here. I'm sorry we're still trapped in this." And I gave him the smallest nod, just the tiniest movement of my head that meant I know. "It's okay. This isn't your fault. You didn't choose this." Because Nathan had been collateral damage in my war with Edward, had been caught between loyalty to a father who didn't deserve it and love for a sister who'd escaped. And he'd chosen to stay, had chosen to play the role of the obedient son, and I didn't blame him for that, didn't judge him, because I knew what it cost to stand up to Edward, knew what it meant to choose yourself over family approval, and not everyone was capable of that choice. Not everyone had the strength or the spite or the desperation that I'd had. Catherine sat to my right, arranging herself in the chair with the kind of careful precision that came from decades of caring more about appearance than comfort. She smoothed her dress, adjusted her pearls, crossed her ankles in that way that finishing schools probably still taught, and then she went completely still, like a photograph, like a woman who'd learned that the less space you took up, the less likely you were to become a target. I'd watched her do this my entire childhood, watched her make herself smaller, quieter, less present, watched her defer to Edward on every decision, every opinion, every moment that required an actual personality, and I'd promised myself I'd never become her, would never trade my voice for security, would never shrink to fit someone else's expectations. And sitting next to her now, watching her twist her napkin until her knuckles turned white, I felt nothing. No pity, no connection, no desire to comfort or rescue, because she'd made her choices. Had chosen Edward over her children every single time, had watched him hurt me and said nothing, done nothing, been nothing except complicit. Edward sat at the head of the table, exactly where he'd always sat, exactly where he'd sat through every family dinner of my childhood. The position of power, the throne, the place from which he could see everyone, judge everyone, control everyone. He didn't offer a greeting, didn't stand when I entered, didn't acknowledge me beyond a slight nod that felt more like a king recognizing a peasant than a father seeing his daughter after 5 years of estrangement. He just reached for the wine. Decanter, a Bordeaux that probably retailed for $3,000 a bottle. Money he definitely didn't have if the debt notice Nathan had photographed was accurate, and he poured himself a glass with hands that almost looked steady, almost looked confident, but I saw it, saw the microscopic tremor when the crystal neck of the bottle touched the rim of the glass, saw him set the bottle down too hard, too fast, trying to hide the shake, trying to maintain the illusion of control, and I knew, then, knew with absolute certainty, that he was terrified, that behind the performance of power, behind the expensive wine, and the formal dining room and the patriarch act, was a man who was drowning, who knew he was drowning, who could see the water rising and didn't know how to save himself. I saw the news, Edward said, not looking at me, focusing on cutting his steak with unnecessary violence, the knife sawing through the meat like he was trying to hurt it. Beginner's luck is a dangerous drug, Morgan. It makes amateur girls think they're actually businesswomen. It makes people who got lucky once think they have skill, think they have judgment, think they can sustain what was probably just a fluke. A moment of being in the right place at the right time with the right investors who were probably just looking for a tax write-off. And I watched him, watched the performance, watched him try to diminish my success, minimize my achievement, reduce 5 years of brutal work into luck, into accident, into anything except what it actually was, which was competence, strategy, relentless execution, everything he'd always told me I didn't have, everything he'd said I'd never be capable of, and I felt that cold detachment settle over me like armor, that clinical distance that came from finally understanding that his opinion meant nothing, that his approval had never been worth chasing. That the man sitting at the head of this table was small, despite his mansion, despite his lineage, despite his performance of superiority. He was small and getting smaller, and I was about to make him microscopic. He took a long sip of wine, his eyes drilling into mine, trying to intimidate, trying to establish dominance the way he always had. And how is the draftsman? He asked, the word draftsman coming out like an insult, like a slur, still playing with his crayons while you do the heavy lifting, still pretending that sketching pictures makes him an architect, still living off your success because he could make it on his own. And there it was, the attack on Daniel, the attempt to make me defend my husband, to get me emotional, to pull me out of my calm and into reaction, because Edward knew how to fight, knew how to find weak points, knew that the fastest way to hurt me was to hurt the people I loved, and Daniel, my husband, the man who'd stood by me when Edward threw me out, who'd worked 16-hour days with me renovating properties, who designed every single hotel in my portfolio, who was brilliant and kind, and everything Edward would never be, Daniel was an obvious target, an easy wound to open. Except 5 years ago those words would have crushed me, would have made me shrink, would have made me try to prove Daniel's worth, to justify my choice, to beg Edward to see what I saw. But tonight those words just bounced off, meaningless, impotent, because I didn't need Edward to validate my husband, didn't need his approval of my marriage, Didn't need anything from him except the confession that was coming. The admission I knew he'd make if I'd just waited long enough, if I just let him talk himself into the trap I'd set. 5 years ago, those insults would have devastated me, I said calmly, reaching for my water glass, letting him see how unbothered I was, how completely his words had failed to land. 5 years ago, I would have tried to defend Daniel, would have listed his credentials, his awards, his achievements, would have begged you to see him the way I see him, but that was before I understood something important about you, Edward. And he stiffened at that, at the use of his first name, at the refusal to call him Dad, at the subtle shift in power dynamics, before I understood that your opinion isn't actually based on merit, isn't based on talent or character or any objective measure of worth. It's based on control. You hate Daniel because I chose him over you, because I chose love over approval, because I chose my own life over the life you'd planned for me, and that choice made me unavailable to manipulate, made me someone you couldn't control, and control is all you've ever really wanted, isn't it? Not children who succeed, not a family that loves each other, just people you can control, people who need you, people who depend on you, and I stopped being one of those people the day I walked out of this house, so your insults don't work anymore, your disapproval doesn't hurt anymore. I don't need you to like Daniel, I don't need you to respect my choices, I don't need anything from you except honesty. And I'm about to get that too, whether you want to give it or not. The room went completely silent. You could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear Catherine's sharp intake of breath, could hear Nathan shifting in his seat, could hear everything except Edward speaking, because Edward was frozen, his wine glass halfway to his lips, his face cycling through expressions too fast to name: shock, fury, calculation, fear. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this, wasn't used to someone refusing to submit, wasn't used to his children, especially his daughter, talking back, standing up, refusing to accept his narrative, and I watched him try to formulate a response, watched his brain work to find the right combination of words that would reestablish dominance, that would put me back in my place, that would restore the natural order where he spoke and I listened, where he judged and I accepted, where he controlled and I obeyed. But before he could find those words, before he could launch his counterattack, I decided to give him what he actually wanted, decided to move past the posturing and the insults and the performance, decided to let him think he was winning, because the trap wasn't ready yet, the moment wasn't right yet. I needed more, needed the confession, needed him to say out loud what he'd done, why he'd done it, needed him to hand me the ammunition I'd used to destroy him. We need to talk about protecting family assets, Edward said finally, setting down his wine glass with deliberate care, his voice dropping into that register that was supposed to sound concerned, reasonable, paternal. I've been speaking with specialists, medical specialists, and they're concerned about you, Morgan. They think you're under tremendous strain, that you're showing signs of instability, of making erratic decisions, of behaving in ways that suggest you might not be capable of managing complex finances, that you might need help, might need supervision, might need someone to step in before you make mistakes that can't be undone. And he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick manila envelope, slid it across the table with the kind of casual confidence that came from thinking he'd already won, thinking this was his checkmate, thinking I'd look at whatever was in that envelope and break, would crumble, would beg him to save me, would sign over everything I'd built just to make this threat go away. And I looked at that envelope, looked at the way it sat there between the crystal glasses and the fine china, looked at the way Nathan's eyes had gone wide, the way Catherine had stopped breathing, the way Edward was watching me with barely concealed triumph, and I realized that whatever was in that envelope was going to be bad, was going to be the weapon he thought would break me, was going to be the reason I'd spend the rest of tonight explaining exactly why. Threats don't work on people who've already survived your worst, on people who've been tested by fire and came out forged, on people who stopped being afraid of you the moment they realized you were just a bully with good lawyers and better wine. And I was about to show him exactly what happened when you threatened someone who'd spent 5 years learning how to fight back. I opened the manila envelope slowly, deliberately, letting Edward watch me, letting him see that I wasn't rattled, wasn't panicking, wasn't giving him the fear response he wanted. Inside were documents, legal documents, psychiatric evaluations, pages and pages of official-looking paperwork with letterheads and signatures and all the trappings of legitimacy. The top document was a draft petition for emergency conservatorship, my name at the top. Beneath it, detailed allegations of severe nervous breakdown, paranoid delusions, inability to manage complex financial decisions, erratic behavior that posed a risk to myself and others, recommendation for immediate psychiatric hold and transfer of all business assets to a court-appointed conservator for my own protection, and underneath that were 3 separate psychiatric evaluations, all saying essentially the same thing. Morgan Hayes is experiencing acute mental health crisis, is not competent to manage her affairs, requires immediate intervention, all signed, all dated within the last week, all ready to be filed with the probate court the moment I refused to cooperate. The moment I didn't give Edward what he wanted, and I looked at those signatures, studied them, recognized one name immediately, Dr. Aries Vance, a psychiatrist I hadn't seen since I was 12 years old, a man who'd evaluated me once after I'd gotten in trouble at school for talking back to a teacher, who'd spent maybe 2 hours with me total over the course of my entire childhood. And now apparently he'd produced a 15-page evaluation detailing my current mental state, my current inability to function, my current need for institutionalization, all without having seen me in 17 years, all based on what? On Edward's phone call, on Edward's story, on Edward's version of who I was and what I needed. I looked up at Edward, at the man who'd just shown me exactly how far he was willing to go, how little he valued me beyond my usefulness, how completely he viewed me as a thing to be controlled rather than a person with rights, with autonomy, with the basic human dignity of being allowed to exist without his permission. Vance, sign this, I said, my voice flat, clinical, because I needed to confirm what I was seeing, needed to make sure I understood the depths of this betrayal before I responded. He hasn't treated me since I was a child, hasn't seen me, hasn't evaluated me, hasn't had any contact with me, and he signed a document saying I'm mentally incompetent. That's perjury. That's fraud. That's a violation of every medical ethics standard that exists. He'd lose his license before the ink dried on this page. So why would he? I paused. Let Edward fill in the blank. Let him confess to the leverage, to the control, to the specific method of manipulation he'd used, and Edward smiled. Actually smiled. That cruel thin stretching of his lips that never reached his eyes. That smile that said he knew he had power, knew he held cards I couldn't counter, knew that he'd bought loyalty, had purchased complicity, had turned a medical professional into a weapon. Vance isn't worried about his license, Edward said, leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. He's worried about the $200,000 in gambling debts I covered for him in Atlantic City last winter, worried about what happens to his marriage, his children, his life if those debts become public, if his wife finds out, if the medical board learns he has a problem. So, he writes exactly what I tell him to write, signs exactly what I tell him to sign, and he does it gratefully because the alternative is losing everything, and I sat there absorbing that information, processing the casual cruelty of it, the calculated manipulation, the way Edward had identified someone's weakness, someone's shame, someone's secret and had weaponized it, had turned a man's addiction and desperation into a tool for controlling me. And I realized this was who Edward had always been. This was what I'd been too young to see clearly as a child. He wasn't just controlling, wasn't just demanding, wasn't just a difficult parent. He was a predator, was someone who collected people's sins and used them as leashes, who built power not through achievement but through blackmail, through leverage, through finding the thing you couldn't afford to lose and threatening to take it unless you gave him what he wanted. And right now what he wanted was my company, my success, my life's work, everything I'd built while he'd been waiting for me to fail. Edward leaned forward, the smell of wine and arrogance rolling off him in waves, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that was supposed to intimidate, supposed to make me understand that he was serious, that this wasn't a bluff, that he would absolutely file these papers, would absolutely have me declared incompetent, would absolutely destroy my reputation, my business, my life, if I didn't give him what he wanted. You sign the transfer of control to me voluntarily, he said, his voice dropping into that dangerous register that I remembered from childhood, that tone that meant someone was about to get hurt. Or Dr. Vance files these evaluations in the morning. Your stock tanks, your investors flee, your board calls for emergency review. The media runs stories about the mentally unstable CEO who built a house of cards, and I take over anyway to save the company, to protect the assets, to preserve what you've built before your incompetence destroys it. It's your choice, Morgan. You can do this the easy way. Sign the papers, step down quietly, let me stabilize the situation, and maybe in a few years when you've proven you're better, when you've shown you can handle stress, we'll discuss transitioning some control back to you. Or you can do this the hard way. Fight me, refuse, and I'll destroy you. I'll file these papers, I'll paint you as crazy, as unstable, as someone who had a lucky break but couldn't handle success. And I'll take everything anyway, so really, it's not much of a choice at all. I looked at the manila envelope, at the documents that represented hours of planning, weeks of preparation, careful manipulation of a desperate doctor, strategic timing designed to hit me when I was most vulnerable, when I just achieved something significant, when I had something worth stealing, and I looked at Edward, at this man who'd spent my entire childhood teaching me that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned, that family was a hierarchy where he sat at the top and everyone else scrambled for position beneath him, and I felt something cold and clear settle into my bones. Not anger, not rage, not the hot emotion he was expecting, just clarity, just understanding, just the absolute certainty that I'd been preparing for this moment without knowing it, that every hard decision I'd made over the past 5 years, every night I'd chosen strategy over sentiment, every time I'd chosen to protect myself over maintaining a relationship with people who didn't deserve. One had been building toward this, toward the moment when Edward would finally overplay his hand, would finally threaten something he couldn't actually take, would finally give me the ammunition I needed to not just defend myself, but to destroy him completely, permanently, irrevocably, in a way that would teach him the lesson he should have learned decades ago, that underestimating people is dangerous. But underestimating the person you tried to destroy is fatal. But I had one question left, one loose thread I needed to cut before I tightened the noose. One piece of information I needed him to give me, one confession I needed to hear in his own words, so I could be absolutely certain, so I would never doubt, so I would never wonder if maybe I'd been too harsh, too ruthless, too willing to destroy him when maybe there was something redeemable underneath. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, and the room went quiet, everyone leaning in slightly, trying to hear, trying to understand, not the business, not the money. I understand greed, I understand desperation. I understand wanting to save yourself. But why Daniel? Why did you hate him enough to try to starve us? He's a brilliant architect. He graduated top of his class. He's won awards. He's respected in his field. He treats me better than any partner I've ever had. So why, Edward, why did you hate him enough to call every major firm in Boston? Why did you blackmail them into not hiring him? Why did you engineer our poverty? What did Daniel ever do to you except love your daughter? Edward chuckled, the sound wet and ugly. The sound of a man who thought the question was naive, who thought I was asking for information I should already understand, who thought the answer was obvious, and he took another sip of wine. Relaxed now, settling back into his chair with the ease of someone who thought the hard part was over, who thought he'd laid out his terms and now just needed to wait for my surrender, who had no idea that the trap was closing, that every word he spoke was another piece of rope, another length of chain, another nail in the coffin he was building for himself. Hate him? Edward repeated, letting the words hang in the air. I don't hate him, Morgan. I don't think about him enough to hate him. He was just a necessary casualty, just collateral damage and a lesson you needed to learn. And he spread his hands like this was all so reasonable, so obvious, so simple that even I should be able to understand it. You needed to learn that you couldn't survive without me. Needed to understand that leaving this family, rejecting my guidance, choosing your own path, that all of that was a fantasy, was childish rebellion that needed to be punished. So I made a few calls, just a few strategic phone calls to people who owed me favors, people who held loans with Hayes Financial, people who understood that if they wanted to maintain their relationship with us, they needed to do me this small favor. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with memory, with the satisfaction of having orchestrated something clever, something effective. I told the top 5 architecture firms in Boston that if they hired your husband, if they gave him any opportunity, any position, any foothold in the city, Hayes Financial would pull every construction loan we held with them, would review every existing agreement, would make their lives professionally difficult. And it worked beautifully, Morgan, it really did. Daniel couldn't get an interview, couldn't get a call back, couldn't understand why his credentials weren't enough, why his portfolio wasn't opening doors, and you started questioning whether leaving was the right choice, started doubting whether you could really make it, started looking tired, started looking scared, and I knew that eventually you'd break, would come back, would admit you'd made a mistake, would beg for forgiveness, would let me fix everything, and then we could move forward, could rebuild our relationship on proper terms, terms where you understood that I was right, that I knew what was best, that my authority existed for a reason. And he paused, took another sip of wine, savored it. I admit I checked your credit reports occasionally, just to see how close you were to breaking, watched your score drop, watched you miss payments, watched you take on debt, and I thought any day now, any day she'll call, any day she'll realize that pride is expensive, and Daddy's love is free. And I was patient, Morgan. I was so patient, waiting for you to learn your lesson, waiting for you to come home. There it was, the confession, the admission, the detailed explanation of exactly what he'd done, why he'd done it, how he'd engineered our suffering not out of hatred but out of something worse, out of pedagogical cruelty, out of the belief that making us suffer was teaching us something valuable, was building character, was preparing us for a lesson about family hierarchy and the cost of disobedience. He'd watched us struggle, had monitored our descent into poverty like it was a science experiment, had checked our credit scores the way other parents check their children's report cards, and he'd done it all while believing he was being a good father, was doing the right thing, was teaching me something I needed to know, and the last microscopic grain of guilt I might have felt for what I was about to do evaporated completely, turned to ash, left nothing behind except cold, clear certainty that this man deserved everything that was coming, deserved to feel exactly what he'd made me feel, deserved to learn that cruelty has consequences, that manipulation has costs, that trying to destroy someone and failing means living with someone who knows exactly what you are and has stopped caring what you think. Quick check-in here because I need to know something. Have you ever had that moment where someone confesses to hurting you and they don't even realize how monstrous they sound, where they explain their cruelty like it was strategy, where they describe your suffering like it was a necessary educational tool, and you realize they genuinely don't understand that what they did was evil, not just wrong but evil? Type the word justice below if you've been there, if you've sat across from someone who hurt you and watched them explain it away like it was reasonable. And from our stats, we've got way more viewers than subscribers. If you're invested in seeing what happens when a predator finally meets someone who knows how to bite back, kindly join our community and hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is Edward learning exactly what I built while he was waiting for me to fail, and trust me, you don't want to miss the moment his face changes from triumph to terror. I reached across the table, slowly, deliberately, and slid the manila envelope with the fake psychiatric evaluations back toward Edward, pushed it across the polished mahogany until it hit his wine glass with a soft tink, a sound that made everyone jump because the room had gone so quiet, so tense, so heavy with anticipation that any noise felt like an explosion. "You love leverage," I said, my voice hardening now, dropping into that cold clinical tone I used in board meetings when I was about to fire someone, when I was about to end a negotiation that wasn't going the way the other party wanted, when I was about to demonstrate that being underestimated is the ultimate strategic advantage. So let's talk about yours. Let's talk about why you're really sitting here threatening to have me institutionalized, why you suddenly care so much about family assets, why tonight, why this dinner, why now. And Edward's smile faltered. Just slightly, just a microscopic crack in the confidence. "What are you talking about?" he said, but his voice had changed, had lost some of that smug certainty, had developed a thread of uncertainty, of concern, of the first dawning recognition that maybe this wasn't going the way he'd planned. "You sign those papers or Vance files in the morning. That was the threat. That was the leverage. That was the gun you thought you were holding to my head." "Dr. Vance can file whatever he wants," I said, pulling my phone out of my purse, setting it on the table between us like a chess piece, like a weapon, like evidence. "It won't matter. It won't stop me. It won't give you what you want because you're not negotiating with the CEO anymore. Edward, you're not threatening a daughter who needs your approval. You're negotiating with your creditor. You're threatening someone who owns something you can't afford to lose." And I watched his face change, watched confusion replace confidence, watched him try to understand what I was saying, what I meant, what card I thought I was playing that could possibly counter the nuclear option he'd just deployed. And I realized he genuinely didn't know, genuinely hadn't considered that I might have been preparing for this, might have seen this coming, might have built my own trap and been waiting for him to walk into it. And that ignorance, that absolute certainty that he was smarter, that he'd planned better, that he held all the power, That ignorance was going to cost him everything, was going to turn this dinner from his victory celebration into his funeral, and I was about to be the one delivering the eulogy, except there would be no kind words, no fond memories, no gentle send-off, just facts, just numbers. Just the cold mathematical reality of what happens when you try to steal from someone who knows how to multiply. I reached under my chair where I'd placed it when I first sat down, pulled out the heavy legal binder I'd been hiding, the one Marcus had couriered to my car before I'd left the office, the one that contained everything I needed, every document, every transfer, every piece of evidence that Edward's world was about to collapse, and I slammed it onto the table between us, the sound echoing through the dining room like a gunshot, like a declaration of war, like the moment when prey becomes predator and the hunter realizes too late that he's been stalking something far more dangerous than he understood. And Edward stared at that binder, his face cycling through expressions, confusion at what it was, concern about why I'd brought it, the first flicker of real fear as his brain started making connections he didn't want to make, started understanding that this wasn't capitulation, wasn't surrender, wasn't me bringing documents to sign over my company. This was something else. Something he hadn't anticipated, something that was about to ruin his entire plan. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight now, controlled but barely, the wine glass in his hand trembling slightly, enough that the liquid inside caught the light and threw tiny shadows on the white tablecloth, and I smiled, not a kind smile, not a warm family reunion smile, but the smile of someone who'd spent 5 years waiting for this exact moment, who'd survived everything he'd thrown at them and come back stronger, sharper, more dangerous. "This is your life, Edward. This is every mistake. You've made every bad decision, every moment of arrogance catching up with you all at once. This is what happens when you spend so much time trying to control other people that you forget to watch your own back." And I opened the binder, turned it around so he could read the cover page, so he could see the letterhead, so he could understand what he was looking at before I explained it, before I destroyed him with his own choices, before I taught him that threatening me was the single biggest mistake of his life. The first document was stamped with the seal of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, official, legal, undeniable, and the header read transfer of debt obligation and security interest. Beneath that was a date from this afternoon, just hours ago, and beneath that were names: Cerberus Capital LLC as seller, Hayes Hospitality Group as buyer, and in the middle, in bold type, the amount, $28 million, the exact amount of Edward's bridge loan, the debt he'd taken on 6 months ago when he'd been desperate, when he'd needed cash fast, when he'd mortgaged everything he had to stay afloat, and I watched him read it, watched his eyes skim the page, watched understanding dawn slowly, painfully, like watching someone realize they're standing on train tracks and hearing the whistle too late to move. "You took out a bridge loan from Cerberus Capital 6 months ago," I said, my voice calm, factual, clinical. $28 million at 18% interest with a 6-month term. You pledged your personal guarantee. You put up your house as secondary collateral, and most importantly, you secured it with 51% of your voting shares in Hayes Financial Holdings. That was the deal. That was what you agreed to when you were desperate and running out of options and couldn't go to traditional lenders because they knew you were a bad risk. You went to loan sharks, legitimate legal loan sharks, but sharks nonetheless, and they gave you the money because they knew that if you defaulted, they'd own you, they'd own your company, they'd own everything you've spent your life pretending to control. Edward's face had gone gray, the color of old newspaper, of ashes, of something dying. "That's confidential," he said, his voice barely working. "How do you know about that? How could you possibly?" And I cut him off, didn't let him finish, didn't give him time to formulate a defense, didn't care about his shock because this was just the beginning. This was just the first piece of information, the first card I was playing. And there were so many more. Cerberus Capital was a shell company, I said. They specialize in high-risk debt. They know their borrowers are likely to default, so they price accordingly, charge exorbitant interest, demand ridiculous collateral, and when default seems imminent, they offload the debt, sell it to someone else for pennies on the dollar, take their loss, move on to the next desperate rich person who needs cash and doesn't have better options. And last week when you were 30 days away from default, when they knew you couldn't possibly repay $28 million, when they'd already written off the loan as a bad debt, they made it available for purchase, and I leaned forward, locked eyes with him, watched him understand where this was going before I even said it. "I bought the note, Edward, I bought your debt, I own the paper, I own the obligation, I own the security interest, I own you. The silence that followed was absolute, was total, was the kind of quiet that comes after explosions, after disasters, after moments when reality shifts so completely that your brain needs time to process, to catch up, to understand that everything you thought was true is now false. Everything you thought was secure is now threatened. Everything you thought you controlled is now owned by someone else. Catherine had stopped breathing, her hand frozen halfway to her throat. Nathan had gone pale, his eyes wide, bouncing between me and Edward like he was watching a car crash in slow motion. And Edward just stared at the documents, his mouth opening and closing, his brain trying to find words, trying to formulate a response, trying to understand how this had happened, how I'd known, how I'd moved fast enough, how I'd beaten him, how he finally managed, his voice cracked, broken. Nothing like the confident patriarch from 10 minutes ago. How did you couldn't have, it's not possible. I was careful. I kept it quiet. Nobody knew except Cerberus and my lawyers. How could you possibly have found out? Nathan, I said simply, looking at my brother, giving him credit, acknowledging his role in this, acknowledging that he'd been feeding me information for months, that he'd been documenting Edward's financial collapse, that he'd been my spy inside this house because he knew, had always known, that Edward's control was built on secrets, and secrets could be weapons if you knew how to use them. Nathan found your default notice in the trash, photographed it, sent it to me, and I did what I always do. When I see an opportunity, I moved fast, I moved decisively, I called my counsel. I told him to buy the debt, to pay whatever premium Cerberus wanted, to get the paper transferred before you even knew it was for sale, and he did. He bought it this afternoon for $18 million, which is a significant discount considering the face value is $28 million, but Cerberus was happy to take the loss because they knew you'd never pay, knew they'd end up in litigation, knew that foreclosing on your assets would be expensive and time-consuming, so they sold it to me, sold it to someone who had the cash, had the motivation, had the desire to own your debt, and now I do. I own $28 million of your obligation, and according to the terms you agreed to, according to the contract you signed, that debt is due in full. I paused, looked at my phone, checked the time, in approximately 32 hours. Edward shot up from his chair so fast his knees hit the table, silverware jumping, glasses tipping, his heavy oak chair crashing backward onto the parquet floor with a sound like thunder, like violence, like something breaking that couldn't be repaired. This is fraud, he bellowed, spit flying from his mouth, his face darkening to that dangerous purple color that meant his blood pressure was spiking, meant he was losing control, meant the mask of civility was cracking. You can't do this. This is illegal. This is manipulation. He lunged for the binder, tried to grab it, tried to rip up the documents like destroying the evidence would change the reality, and Nathan jumped up, his chair screeching backward. Dad, stop, he said, his voice urgent, pleading, but Edward shoved him, actually physically shoved his own son, and Nathan stumbled into the sideboard, knocking over the crystal decanter that had held the expensive Bordeaux, and it exploded on the floor, shattered into thousands of glittering pieces that caught the light like diamonds, like evidence, like the fragments of Edward's power scattered across expensive flooring. Sit down, Edward roared at Nathan, his voice raw, barely human. Sit down, you coward, you traitor, you helped her, you betrayed your own father. And Nathan just stood there, breathing hard, a cut on his hand from the broken glass, blood dripping onto the floor, and he didn't sit down, didn't apologize, didn't cower the way Edward expected. He just looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes, relief, gratitude, the recognition that the tyrant was finally falling, that the reign of terror was ending, that someone had finally stood up and fought back and won. I didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react to Edward's rage because I'd seen this before, had grown up watching him explode when things didn't go his way, had learned that his anger was a performance, was a tool, was designed to intimidate people into compliance, and it didn't work on me anymore, hadn't worked for years. I just sat there calmly, phone in hand, thumb hovering over a message I'd already typed out, already prepared, one word, execute, addressed to Marcus, to my legal team, to the people who were waiting for my signal, waiting to file documents, waiting to turn this private conversation into public record, waiting to make Edward's nightmare official. Go ahead, I said. my voice cutting through his panting, his rage, his desperate attempt to fight something he couldn't fight. Tear it up, burn it, eat it if you want. And Edward froze, pages crumpled in his fists, chest heaving, face red, looking at me like I was something he didn't recognize, something dangerous, something that shouldn't exist. It doesn't matter, I continued. That binder is a courtesy copy. That's just paper. The real documents are digital, are filed, are recorded with the county clerk. My legal team was waiting for my signal, and I gave it to them before I even sat down at this table. They filed the confession of judgment while you were telling me about your leverage, while you were threatening me with fake psychiatric holds, while you were explaining how you engineered Daniel's poverty like it was something to be proud of. And I tapped the table once, hard, making everyone jump. It's done. Edward, the debt is called. The default is registered. You have 32 hours to come up with $28 million, or I seize the collateral. And the collateral is your company, your legacy, your voting shares, everything you are. Edward let the binder fall with a heavy thud that echoed through the silent room, his hands shaking now, no longer trying to hide it, no longer maintaining the performance. You can't, he said, but his voice was weak now, desperate. I have assets, I have the house, I have investments, I can liquidate, I can pay. I just need time. I just need you to extend the term, to renegotiate, to work with me. And I shook my head, not angry, not vindictive, just resolute, just final, just done with him in every possible way. The house takes months to sell, I said. Investments take weeks to liquidate. You don't have months, Edward. You don't have weeks. You have 32 hours, and even if you could sell everything tomorrow, even if you could get full market value, which you won't because distressed sales never do, you'd still be short. You'd still owe me millions. You'd still lose the company. And that's assuming I'm willing to wait. Assuming I'm willing to negotiate. Assuming I have any interest in helping you solve a problem you created. And I stood up, smoothed my dress, looked down at him like he was small, like he was nothing, like he was exactly what he'd always called other people who disappointed him. Like I said, I didn't come here to negotiate a surrender. I came to serve an eviction notice. And I stepped around the table, walked toward him, watched him back away from me like I was dangerous, like I was the threat. You want to know the really beautiful part? I asked, leaning in close enough to smell the sour wine and fear coming off him. The really perfectly ironic part. And I pulled out my phone, showed him the screen, showed him the document that was already filed, that was already public record under UCC Article 9. A secured creditor can seize voting rights immediately upon default to protect the asset. I'm the creditor, Edward. The note defaulted the moment you threatened me tonight, the moment you made it clear you were a risk to the collateral. So I exercised my rights. I took control of your shares. I own 51% of Hayes Financial Holdings as of, I checked the timestamp, 6:48 p.m., 18 minutes ago, while you were explaining why you tortured us, while you were confessing to destroying Daniel's career, while you were threatening to have me institutionalized. I was taking your company. I was firing you from your own board. I was ending everything you've built. And you didn't even notice because you were too busy performing power you didn't actually have. Edward's phone started buzzing in his pocket, then mine, then Nathan's. An ugly chorus of alerts, of notifications, of the digital world catching up with the analog one, of reality manifesting in real time. That's probably the board secretary, I said calmly, conversationally, like we were discussing the weather, like I hadn't just destroyed a man's entire life in the span of one dinner. They've been notified of the change in control. They've been told that there's a new majority shareholder, that the voting structure has changed, that decisions need to be made about leadership. And I held his gaze, watched him break, watched the moment when he understood that this wasn't a threat, wasn't a negotiation, wasn't something he could fight or manipulate or control. This was done, was finished, was irreversible. Congratulations on your retirement, Dad, I said, the word dad dripping with sarcasm, with the acknowledgement that this man had never really been a father, had never earned that title, had only ever been a bully with money and a last name. You've just been fired from your own company. You have 30 days to clear out your office, to collect your personal effects, to say goodbye to the legacy you've spent your life pretending to build. And after that, after you're gone, I'm going to do something you never thought was possible. I'm going to make Hayes Financial actually mean something, actually stand for something other than leveraged cruelty and inherited arrogance. I'm going to turn it into something real, something earned, something that matters, and you're going to watch me do it. You're going to see what someone who actually worked for their success can build when they're not wasting energy destroying their own children. And that watching, that seeing, that understanding what you threw away when you threw me away, that's going to hurt worse than losing the company, worse than losing the money, Worse than losing everything you thought defined you, because you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing that the daughter you called broken, the daughter you tried to starve, the daughter you engineered poverty for, that daughter beat you, outsmarted you, took everything you had, and you never saw it coming because you were too busy underestimating her to notice she'd become someone you should have feared. Edward stared at his phone screen like it was written in a language he'd never learned, his fingers scrolling through alerts and messages with movements that got slower, more mechanical, more disconnected with each passing second. The color had drained from his face so completely it looked like gravity had stolen it, had pulled all the blood down toward his feet, leaving nothing behind except gray skin stretched over bone. And he sagged into his chair, not sitting but collapsing, the air rushing out of him like a punctured tire, like something that had been holding shape only through pressure, and now the pressure was gone, and all that remained was deflated rubber, useless, empty, done. And I watched this transformation, this reduction, this moment when a giant in my life became just a mean old man who'd borrowed too much money to fund an image he couldn't sustain, who'd built an empire on leverage and lies, and was now discovering that leverage cuts both ways, that lies have expiration dates, that eventually the bill comes due, and the currency is everything you thought you owned, everything you thought you were, everything you thought made you matter. He turned to Catherine, his wife, the woman who'd stood beside him through decades of marriage, through whatever private hells and public performances they'd endured together. Catherine, he rasped, his voice broken, destroyed, sounding like someone who'd been screaming for hours even though he'd barely spoken. Tell her this is insanity. Tell her she can't do this. Tell her we're family. Tell her something that will make her stop. And I watched my mother's face, watched her process what she was hearing, watched her understand that the man she'd married, the man she'd built her entire identity around, the man whose status had been her status, whose power had been her power, that man was finished, was ruined, was being dismantled by the daughter she'd failed to protect, failed to love, failed to see as anything more than a supporting character in their family story, and for the first time in my entire memory, for the first time in 34 years of watching her perform the role of dutiful wife, she didn't jump to his defense, didn't soothe, didn't smooth, didn't try to fix. She just sat there with her twisted napkin and her expensive pearls and her carefully maintained appearance, and she looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been terror, or might have been awe, or might have been the dawning realization that the daughter she'd pitted, the daughter she'd watched suffer and said nothing, the daughter she'd written off as lost, that daughter had just done something she'd never had the courage to do, had stood up to Edward, had beaten him, had taken everything he valued and made it hers, and that power shift, that transfer of control, that moment when the victim became the victor, it was rewriting every assumption she'd built her life on, every belief about how power worked, about who got to have it, about what happened to women who chose themselves over men who demanded obedience. Catherine took a sip of water, her hand shaking slightly, making the glass rattle against her teeth, and she said nothing, literally nothing, just set the glass down and looked away, and that silence, that refusal to come to his rescue, that absence of the automatic wifely support Edward had counted on for 40 years, that silence was louder than anything she could have said, was a crack in their united front, was the first indication that maybe, just maybe, she'd finally seen clearly what he was, what he'd always been, what she'd enabled and protected and made possible through her complicity, and Edward heard that silence, understood what it meant, looked at her with something like betrayal in his eyes, like she'd broken an unspoken contract, like her job was to support him unconditionally and she was failing, and I realized that even now, even in this moment of absolute defeat, he still thought other people existed to serve his needs, to prop up his ego, to validate his version of reality. He'd learn nothing, would die believing he was right and the world was wrong, and that stubbornness, that absolute inability to see himself clearly, that was going to make what came next even easier, even cleaner, even more justified. Nathan picked up the wine glass he hadn't touched all evening, his hand bleeding from the cut he'd gotten when Edward shoved him into the sideboard, and he took a long, slow drink, let the wine sit in his mouth for a moment before swallowing, and then he set the glass down carefully, deliberately, and he looked at me across the table, and the corner of his mouth twitched. just slightly, just barely visible, but unmistakable if you were watching, and I knew what that expression meant. I'd seen it. Before, in moments of private rebellion, in small acts of defiance that Edward never noticed. It was Nathan's way of saying, I'm with you. I support this. I've been waiting for someone to do this for years, and I'm glad it's you. It was a salute, was acknowledgement, was the breaking of his own chains even if he wasn't ready to walk away yet, even if he still lived under Edward's roof and played the role of obedient son. Something had shifted, some fundamental power dynamic had changed, and Nathan was letting me know he saw it, recognized it, was grateful for it, was maybe even inspired by it. And I gave him the smallest nod back, barely a movement, just enough to say, I see you, I appreciate you, you helped make this possible, and I won't forget it. You have 30 days, I said, letting the words settle over the room like a heavy blanket, like fog, like something you couldn't escape. 30 days to vacate the CEO's suite at the Hayes building downtown. I've already instructed building security to revoke your access pass effective midnight tonight. Tomorrow you can go in with an escort to collect personal items, photos, plants, whatever trinkets and memorabilia you've accumulated, but leave the files, leave the records, leave anything that belongs to the company, because it's not yours anymore, it's mine, and my team will be auditing everything starting Monday morning, every account, every transaction, every decision you've made in the last 5 years, and if I find evidence of misappropriation, if I discover you've been looting the company to fund your lifestyle, to cover your gambling debts, to pay off people like Dr. Vance, I won't just fire you, Edward. I'll prosecute you. I'll file criminal charges. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what you are. And I held his gaze, held it until he looked away, until he couldn't maintain eye contact anymore, until he understood that the daughter he'd terrorized was gone, and the woman sitting across from him now was someone who didn't fear him, didn't need him, didn't owe him anything except the truth, and the truth was going to be expensive. I didn't call him dad, couldn't make myself use that word anymore, couldn't pretend that DNA created obligation, that shared genetics meant anything when the relationship had been built on control and cruelty and the systematic destruction of anything that threatened his dominance. He'd lost the right to that title years ago, had forfeited it when he'd chosen power over love, had surrendered it when he'd locked those gates and told me I was dead to the family, and now I was just returning the favor, was telling him that whatever connection we'd had, whatever bond might have existed before he'd poisoned it, that was gone, was finished, was as dead as he'd wanted me to believe I was to him, except I was alive, was thriving, was successful beyond anything he'd imagined, and he was the one dying, was the one being erased, was the one discovering what it felt like to be expendable, disposable, forgotten, and I hoped it hurt, hoped it burned, hoped he felt every ounce of pain he'd inflicted on me reflected back at him multiplied by 5 years of compounding interest. I picked up my purse, stood, smoothed my dress, prepared to leave, and I expected to feel something, expected the weight of what I'd done to crush me, to make me doubt, to trigger guilt or remorse or second thoughts. But instead I felt light, felt weightless, felt like the chains I'd been carrying since childhood had finally been cut, felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in my life, like the air in my lungs was mine, like the space I occupied belonged to me, like I didn't have to shrink anymore, didn't have to apologize for existing, didn't have to earn the right to be seen, I just existed, just took up space without needing permission from people who'd never deserved the power I'd given them, and that freedom, that liberation, that absolute certainty that I'd done the right thing, that feeling was worth more than the company, more than the money, more than anything I'd gained tonight, because what I'd gained was myself, was the ability to look in the mirror and recognize the woman staring back, was the knowledge that I'd stood up, fought back, won. Morgan, Catherine whispered, her voice small, fragile, nothing like the glass-smooth confidence she usually projected. Where are you going? What happens now? And I looked at her, at this woman who'd watched me suffer and said nothing, who'd chosen her comfort over my safety, who'd been complicit in every wound Edward had inflicted, and I felt nothing, no anger, no bitterness, no desire for revenge. Just absence, just the vast empty space where a mother-daughter relationship should have been but never was home. I said simply, to my husband, to the man you both tried to destroy, to the life I built without your help, without your approval, without your money, To everything you said I couldn't have, couldn't achieve, couldn't build. And I'm going to sleep peacefully tonight knowing that I don't owe you anything, don't need to prove anything to you, don't need to maintain a relationship with people who only know how to take, who only know how to hurt, who only know how to use love as a weapon. I'm done, Catherine, I'm done performing for you. Done seeking approval from people who were never going to give it. Done pretending this is a family when it's really just a collection of people who share DNA and nothing else. And that ending, that closure, that final severing of obligation, that's not cruelty. That's self-preservation. That's choosing myself after 34 years of being taught that choosing myself was selfish. And I'm fine with you thinking I'm selfish. I'm fine with you telling your friends I'm ungrateful. I'm fine with whatever story you need to tell to make sense of this, because I know the truth, and the truth is that I survived you, both of you. I survived and I thrived, and that's all that matters. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking steady, unbothered rhythm across the parquet, each step a statement, a declaration, a confirmation that I was leaving and not coming back, that this was goodbye not just to tonight but to everything, to the house, to the family, to the expectation that someday we'd reconcile, that someday I'd forgive, that someday time would heal wounds that were still actively being inflicted. And behind me I heard Edward's voice, broken, raw, desperate. You ungrateful witch. He screamed, the words sharp, ugly, the last gasp of a tyrant out of ammunition, out of leverage, out of power. I made you, you're nothing without me. You wouldn't exist without me. Everything you are is because of what I gave you, and I stopped walking just for a moment, just long enough to look back over my shoulder, just long enough to deliver one final truth he needed to hear. You gave me genetics, Edward. You gave me DNA. You gave me nothing else, no support, no belief, no love that wasn't conditional. And everything I am, everything I built, everything I achieved, I did in spite of you, not because of you. I did it while you were actively trying to destroy me, while you were sabotaging my husband, while you were monitoring my credit score like it was entertainment. I did it while you were waiting for me to fail, hoping I'd fail, needing me to fail so you could be right, so you could maintain your narrative that you were superior, that you were necessary, that people couldn't survive without your guidance, and I proved you wrong. Edward, I proved that not only could I survive without you, I could thrive, could exceed, could build something you never could have built because you don't know how to create, only how to control, only how to take, only how to destroy. And now you're learning what happens when you spend your life destroying people. Eventually one of them survives, becomes strong, comes back, and returns the favor. I didn't wait for his response, didn't give him the opportunity to have the last word, didn't care what he shouted after me as I walked through the foyer, past the museum-quality furniture, past the imported chandelier, past all the expensive emptiness that he'd confused with worth, with meaning, with legacy. I walked out the front door, down the stone steps, across the circular driveway to my car, and I didn't look back, didn't pause, didn't give him even the smallest indication that anything he said or did could affect me, could hurt me, could make me doubt my choices, because you don't look back at burning buildings once you've made it out alive. You don't give arsonists the satisfaction of watching you mourn what they tried to destroy. You just keep walking, keep breathing, keep living, and eventually the smoke clears and you realize you're free, you're safe, you're exactly where you were always meant to be, and the fire that was supposed to kill you only burned away the parts that were never really you anyway, the parts that were performing, pretending, trying to fit into spaces too small for the person you were becoming. My penthouse was quiet when I got home. No fanfare. No victory celebration, no dramatic music, just the hum of Boston below and the smell of garlic and basil drifting from the kitchen where Daniel was cooking dinner like this was any other Saturday night, like his wife hadn't just destroyed her father and taken over his company, like nothing extraordinary had happened, and maybe for him nothing had. Maybe this was just another day of our life together, another evening of being partners, being teammates, being the family we'd built from nothing when the family we were born into had rejected us, had tried to break us, had failed completely because they'd underestimated what we were capable of when we stopped trying to win their approval and started fighting for each other. Daniel turned when he heard me come in, wooden spoon in hand, paint-stained t-shirt he'd been wearing since college, off-key humming to a jazz record, and he smiled, not a congratulations smile, not a you did it smile, just his regular Saturday smile, the one that meant I'm happier home, I made dinner, I love you, hey. He said warmly, I made your favorite. Cheap noodles with expensive wine. Tradition, and I crossed to him, wrapped my arms around him, pressed my face into his neck, into the smell of soap and sawdust and safety, into the scent of someone who'd never once made me feel like I needed to earn his love, who'd never demanded I prove my worth, who just loved me, consistently, unconditionally, without keeping score, and I felt the tension holding my spine upright for hours finally snap, felt the adrenaline drain, felt the weight of what I'd done settle into my bones not as regret but as relief, as completion, as the closing of a chapter I'd been trying to finish for 5 years. It's done, I whispered against his skin, he's gone. And Daniel held me tighter, didn't ask for details, didn't ask what done meant, didn't need the play-by-play because he trusted me, trusted my judgment, trusted that whatever I'd done was necessary, was justified, was the right choice even if it was hard. We're free, he said softly, and we were finally free from Edward's shadow, from his threats, from the fear that someday he'd find a way to hurt us again, to take something else, to remind us that in his mind we were still his property, still under his control, still subject to his whims, but that fear was gone now, was dead, was buried under the weight of legal documents and transferred debt, and the absolute certainty that Edward Hayes had no power over us anymore, had nothing we needed, had nothing we wanted, had nothing we couldn't live without, and that knowledge, that security, that freedom, was worth everything it had cost, every moment of discomfort, every second of confrontation, every word I'd spoken that couldn't be unsaid, because those words, those actions, those choices, they'd built a wall between his toxicity and our peace, and that wall was permanent, was solid, was exactly what we needed. We ate dinner on the balcony, just pasta and wine and conversation, talking about the new hotel design, about whether we should expand into California, about adopting a dog, about normal things, about future things, about life things that had nothing to do with Edward or Hayes' financial or family drama. We talked about our life, the one we'd built brick by brick without anyone's permission, without anyone's help, without anyone's approval, and it felt good, felt right, felt like this was always how it was supposed to be, just us. Just our choices, just our future stretching out ahead of us full of possibilities that were ours to choose, ours to build, ours to shape into whatever we wanted without anyone telling us we couldn't, without anyone sabotaging our efforts, without anyone trying to make us fail so they could feel superior, and sitting there watching the city lights blink on like fireflies, watching Daniel talk about his latest architectural concept, watching the life we'd built together continue uninterrupted by the people who'd tried to destroy it. I realized that this quiet moment of peace, this absence of drama, this ability to just exist without fighting, without defending, without constantly having to prove we deserve to be happy, this was the real victory. This was what I'd actually won tonight. Not a company, not money, not revenge, just peace, just freedom, just the ability to live without looking over my shoulder waiting for the next attack. And that was worth everything, was worth more than Edward's empire, was worth more than any inheritance I might have received if I'd played the obedient daughter, was worth every hard decision, every difficult conversation, every moment of standing alone against people who were supposed to stand with me, because I'd chosen right, had chosen myself, had chosen love, had chosen life, and Edward and Catherine, and everyone who'd sided with them. They'd chosen control, chosen image, chosen a legacy, built on sand, and now they were discovering what happens when the tide comes in and washes away foundations built on lies, built on cruelty, built on the false assumption that power could be inherited rather than earned. And their discovery, their reckoning, their loss, none of it was my responsibility, none of it was my problem, none of it was my concern, because I'd drawn a line, had built a boundary, had said no more, and that no was complete, was final, was exactly what I should have said years ago, but finally had the strength to say now, and saying it, meaning it, enforcing it. That was the beginning of everything, was the foundation of a life where I got to decide who I was, what I valued, how I lived, and nobody, not even the man who'd raised me, got to take that away. 3 months after the dinner that ended Edward's empire, I stood in what used to be his corner office at the Hayes building. The nameplate on the door had been changed, polished brass that now read Morgan Hayes, CEO, and the view from these windows was different than the view from my old office, higher, wider, showing more of a city that had watched me fall and never expected me to get back up, let alone climb higher than I'd started. The office itself had been gutted, every piece of Edward's dark wood furniture removed, every oil painting of dead ancestors taken down, every symbol of inherited power stripped away and replaced with clean lines, natural light. Furniture I'd chosen myself not because it was expensive, but because it was functional, because it served the work rather than performing status. And sitting at the desk I'd brought from my own company, working on a laptop that contained the merger plans integrating Hayes Financial with Hayes Hospitality, I felt something I'd never felt in this building, in this family, in this legacy. I felt like I belonged, not because of my last name, not because of genetics, not because someone had given me permission, but because I'd earned it, had fought for it, had proven I could do something Edward never could, which was actually create value rather than just protecting what previous generations had built. The transition had been brutal, exactly as brutal as I'd expected. Edward had 30 days to clear out, 30 days to say goodbye to the life he'd built his identity around, and he'd used every single one of those days trying to fight, trying to find loopholes, trying to convince board members to override my authority, trying to rally support from shareholders who'd been loyal to him for decades. But the debt was ironclad, the security agreement was clear, the legal transfer was absolute, and every lawyer he consulted told him the same thing. There was no way out, no technicality, no appeal. I owned his shares, controlled the board, had the votes, had the power, and he had nothing except 30 days to accept reality, which he never did, not really, even on the last day. Even when security escorted him from the building carrying a cardboard box with his nameplate and a few personal photos. Even then he was threatening lawsuits, promising revenge, telling anyone who would listen that this wasn't over, that I'd made a mistake, that he'd find a way to take back what was his, except it had never been his, not really. He'd just been holding it, stewarding it, borrowing it from a future that had finally arrived and demanded payment, and the payment was everything. The media had a field day, business sections running stories about the dramatic power shift at Hayes Financial, about the daughter who'd been disowned returning to take over the family empire, about Edward Hayes's fall from grace, about mysterious debts and hostile takeovers and family drama that read like fiction but was documented fact. And I did exactly 3 interviews, carefully selected outlets, carefully controlled narrative, and in each one I said essentially the same thing. I built my own company from nothing. My father and I had philosophical differences about business and family. When the opportunity arose to bring Hayes Financial's resources into alignment with modern hospitality management, I took it. This isn't personal, this is business. This is about creating value for shareholders and opportunities for employees and a legacy that's earned rather than inherited. And the reporters would push, would ask about the estrangement, about the debt, about whether this was revenge, and I would smile, would stay calm, would repeat, this is about building something sustainable, something real, something that serves a purpose beyond ego. My father ran Hayes Financial his way for 40 years. Now it's my turn, and we'll see what 20 years of my leadership produces versus 20 years of his. The market will decide, the employees will decide, the community will decide, and I'm confident in that judgment because I'm not afraid of accountability. I'm not afraid of being measured by results rather than by performance, and that confidence, that certainty, that absolute lack of defensiveness, it was catnip to reporters who were used to scandal, to drama, to people who crumbled under pressure, and by the 3rd interview they'd stopped asking about Edward and started asking about my vision, my strategy, my plans for the future, and that shift, that change in narrative, that was when I knew I'd won completely, had won not just the legal battle but the story. Had become the protagonist in a narrative where Edward was just the antagonist who'd served his purpose and could now exit stage left into irrelevance. Edward and Catherine had been forced to sell the estate, the house I'd grown up in, the mansion that had represented everything they valued, status, legacy, the physical manifestation of their superiority. They'd listed it for $12 million and gotten 8, a distressed sale that everyone in their social circle knew about, knew meant they were desperate, were broke, were no longer the people they'd pretended to be, and with the proceeds they'd paid off some debts. Not all. Never all. Edward's financial situation was worse than even I'd known. Decades of leveraging, of borrowing against assets, of spending more than they earned to maintain appearances, And the bridge loan from Cerberus had just been the most recent, most toxic, most catastrophic example of a pattern that had been building for years. They'd moved to a condo, modest by their standards, 2 bedrooms in a building that was nice but not exclusive, the kind of place where doctors and lawyers lived, successful people but not wealthy people, not people with family legacies and society connections, just regular rich people. And for Edward and Catherine, that reduction, that downsizing, that loss of the physical space that had defined them, it was worse than losing money, was worse than losing the company, because the house had been the stage, had been the set, had been the backdrop for the performance they'd been giving their entire lives. And without it, they were just 2 older people who'd made bad choices and were living with consequences. Nothing special, nothing impressive, nothing worth envying or emulating. Nathan had finally moved out, had taken the money I'd offered him, a generous severance for years of being the dutiful son, for feeding me information, for helping me when helping me meant betraying the father who'd never really valued him except as an extension of his own ego. And Nathan had used that money to start his own business, something small, something he was passionate about, sustainable architecture consulting, working with Daniel, actually, the 2 of them partnering on projects that mattered, that served communities, that weren't about making maximum profit but about making actual difference. And watching my brother become himself, become someone other than Edward's shadow, become happy for the first time since I could remember, that was almost as satisfying as taking the company, almost as meaningful as the victory, because Nathan had been collateral damage, had been trapped, had been suffering in ways he'd never been able to articulate, and giving him the resources to escape, to choose himself, to build his own life. That felt like the right use of power, felt like the kind of legacy worth building, the kind that freed people rather than trapping them, that elevated rather than diminished, that said your worth isn't determined by your usefulness to me. Your worth is inherent, is yours, is something no one can take away. I'd gotten one letter from Edward, about 6 weeks after his eviction, handwritten on plain paper because apparently even his personalized stationery had been too expensive to keep. The letter was 3 pages of vitriol, of accusations, of promises that he'd find a way to destroy me, that I'd regret what I'd done. That blood was supposed to mean something and I'd betrayed it, that daughters owed fathers respect, that I was ungrateful, vindictive, cruel, that I'd taken advantage of a temporary setback to steal what rightfully belonged to him, that the debt purchase had been fraud, that the conservatorship documents had been legitimate, that Dr. Vance's evaluation had been accurate, that I was mentally unstable and everyone would eventually see it, that my success was luck and would evaporate, that Daniel would leave me once he realized I was just like Edward, that I die alone and bitter and regretful, and on and on. 3 pages of a man who couldn't accept that he'd lost, who couldn't acknowledge his own role in his destruction, who couldn't see that every wound he was complaining about was self-inflicted. And I'd read that letter once, carefully, looking for any hint of self-awareness, any fragment of understanding, any sign that somewhere under the rage was recognition that maybe, just maybe, he'd made mistakes, had hurt people, had earned this outcome, but there was nothing, just blame, just victimhood, just the absolute conviction that he was right and the world was wrong. And I'd folded that letter, filed it in a drawer labeled family correspondence, archived, not destroyed because it was evidence, was documentation, was proof that I'd made the right choice in cutting contact, in refusing reconciliation, in understanding that some people are incapable of change, incapable of growth, incapable of love that isn't conditional, transactional, weaponized. Catherine had reached out too, more subtly, through intermediaries, friends of friends, society connections who'd known me as a child and felt obligated to facilitate healing, to encourage forgiveness, to suggest that family was family, and time healed all wounds. And surely after a few months, I could see my way to at least having coffee, at least talking, at least giving her the opportunity to explain, except there was nothing to explain, nothing I didn't already understand. Catherine had made her choices, had chosen Edward over me every single time, had watched him hurt me and said nothing, done nothing, been nothing except complicit, and complicity, I'd learned, was just another form of cruelty, was just another way of saying I see you being harmed, and I'm choosing not to stop it. And that choice, that pattern of choosing comfort over courage, that was something I couldn't forgive, couldn't forget, couldn't pretend didn't matter, just because time had passed, because I was successful, because holding boundaries made other people uncomfortable. So I'd sent a message through those same intermediaries, polite, final, explaining that I wished Catherine no harm, held no active ill will, simply had no interest in maintaining a relationship with someone who'd failed to protect me when protection was needed, who'd failed to love me when love was required, who'd failed to be a mother in any meaningful sense, and now wanted credit for the biology, wanted access to the success, wanted to claim connection to something she'd had no part in building, and the answer was no, was always going to be no, was no without anger, without drama, without negotiation, just no, complete, final, the end. The merged company, Hayes Hospitality Financial Holdings, was exceeding projections. Combining Edward's traditional financial services with my hospitality expertise had created synergies nobody had anticipated, opportunities nobody had seen, ways of serving clients that neither company could have done alone, and the employees, the people who'd worked under Edward for years, who'd been terrified when I took over, who'd expected me to be vindictive, to fire everyone, to burn it all down out of spite, they were thriving, were grateful, were telling anyone who would listen that the new leadership actually listened to ideas, actually valued input, actually treated them like humans instead of resources to be exploited, and productivity was up, retention was up, innovation was up, everything Edward had said would be destroyed by my incompetence was actually improving under my leadership, was proving that fear-based management, that control through intimidation that leadership built on, making people feel small, that wasn't strength, that was weakness, was insecurity masquerading as authority, and real leadership, the kind built on trust and competence, and the willingness to acknowledge you don't have all the answers, that was what actually worked, what actually built sustainable success, what actually created something worth being proud of. I got a notification one morning, 6 months after the takeover, an alert from a monitoring service I'd set up. Edward Hayes had declared bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy, Chapter 7, liquidation of all remaining assets. The condo sold, the cars sold, everything sold except what bankruptcy law allowed him to keep, basic furniture, basic household items, basic dignity. And he and Catherine had moved into a small apartment, 1-bedroom, subsidized housing for low-income seniors, the kind of place they'd driven past for 40 years and never imagined they'd occupy, never thought applied to them, never considered was a possibility. And reading that notification, I waited to feel something, waited for satisfaction or vindication or glee, waited for the rush of knowing my enemy had fallen as far as I could fall, but all I felt was tired, just exhausted by the whole thing, by the years of fighting, by the energy it took to maintain boundaries, by the emotional labor of refusing to feel guilty for protecting myself. And I realized that Edward's bankruptcy didn't make me happy because his suffering had never been the goal, his destruction had never been the point. I just wanted him to stop hurting me, to stop threatening me, to stop trying to control me. And the most efficient way to ensure that happened permanently was to remove his power, to take away his weapons, to make it so he couldn't hurt me even if he wanted to. And that mission was accomplished, was complete, was done. And what he did after that, whether he thrived or collapsed, whether he learned or stayed bitter, whether he died angry or found peace, none of that was my responsibility. None of that was my concern. I'd drawn the line, built the wall, created the distance, and what happened on his side of that wall was his business, his choices, his consequences, not mine. Daniel and I celebrated our 7th anniversary that year. 7 years since we'd gotten married, in a tiny ceremony with 5 guests while Edward was telling people we'd be divorced within a year, that Daniel would leave once the money ran out, that I'd come crawling back begging for forgiveness, and here we were, 7 years later, more in love than ever, more successful than Edward had ever been, more happy than I'd thought was possible when I was 23 and being thrown out of my family. And we went to dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, nothing fancy, just good food and better company, and Daniel gave me a gift, small box wrapped in simple paper. And inside were pearl earrings, antique, beautiful, and a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. These belong to your grandmother. She would have wanted you to have them. Love, Catherine. And I stared at those pearls, at the only thing Catherine had sent me in 6 months, at what might have been an olive branch, or might have been guilt, or might have been acknowledgement that grandmothers and mothers are different relationships, and maybe some legacies should skip generations, should go from grandmother, who understood value, to granddaughter, who created it rather than stopping at the mother, who'd only known how to maintain appearances. I didn't keep them for sentiment, kept them as a reminder, as evidence, as proof that I came from somewhere, from someone, from a line of women who'd had strength even if they'd used it differently, even if they'd expressed it through survival rather than rebellion, even if they'd chosen to endure rather than escape. And wearing those earrings wasn't about reconciliation, wasn't about forgiveness, wasn't about letting Catherine back in. It was about honoring the complicated truth that families are messy, that legacies are complex, that you can reject the dysfunction while claiming the parts that matter, the parts that connect you to something larger than the immediate pain. And my grandmother, who I'd barely known, who died when I was young, she would have been proud, I think, would have seen me take control of the company her husband had built, would have recognized that sometimes the best thing you can do with an inheritance is burn down what's broken and rebuild it better. And that rebuilding, that transformation, that willingness to take something diseased and make it healthy even if the process is painful, that was the real legacy. That was what actually mattered. That was what I wanted to pass on to whatever children Daniel and I might have. Not money, not property, not a company, just the understanding that you're allowed to choose yourself, allowed to set boundaries, allowed to walk away from people who hurt you even if they're family, especially if they're family, because family should be the people who make you stronger, not the people who require you to stay small so they can feel big. And I'd learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, had learned it by living it, by surviving it, by becoming someone who couldn't be destroyed because I'd already been through fire and come out forged. And that knowledge, that strength, that certainty, nobody could take it away. Not Edward, not Catherine, not anyone. It was mine, was earned, was the real inheritance, the one that actually mattered. And sitting there with Daniel in that restaurant, wearing my grandmother's pearls, planning our future, building our life, I finally understood what freedom felt like, what peace tasted like, what home meant when you built it yourself rather than trying to earn permission to occupy someone else's space. And it was everything, was worth everything, was exactly what I'd been fighting for even when I didn't have words for it, even when I thought I was just surviving, even when I believed I was broken because that's what they'd told me. Turns out I was never broken, never defective, never less than. I was just being measured by the wrong people using the wrong metrics. And once I started measuring myself by my own standards, by whether I was kind, whether I was honest, whether I built things that mattered, whether I treated people well, whether I lived with integrity, once I started using those measurements, everything changed, everything clicked. Everything made sense, and I became exactly who I was always meant to be, someone who survived her family, took their company, and turned it into something worth having, something worth building, something worth passing on. And that transformation, that journey from victim to victor, from broken to whole, from controlled to free, that's the story I'll tell someday to children who need to hear it, who need to know that you can survive your family trying to destroy you and come out stronger, that you can take the weapons they used against you and turn them into tools for building something better, that you can refuse to let their cruelty define you, their rejection diminish you, their hatred poison you. You can choose different, choose better, choose yourself. And that choice, that brave, terrifying, necessary choice, that's where real life begins. That's where freedom lives. That's where you finally get to breathe. And I'm breathing now, finally, completely, without apology, without permission, without guilt. And it's the best thing I've ever done. Better than the company, better than the victory, better than the revenge. Just the simple revolutionary act of choosing myself and meaning it and living it every single day until it stops being a choice and starts being who I am. And if you're watching this, if you've stayed with me through this entire story, through every moment of pain and triumph and reckoning, then maybe you need to hear this too. Maybe you're standing where I stood. Maybe you have family who treats you like I was treated. Maybe you think you can't escape, can't survive, can't build anything better. And I'm here to tell you that you can, that I did, that it's possible. And it starts with one decision, one moment, one choice to value yourself over people who don't value you. And everything else, all the success, all the freedom, all the peace, it flows from that. So make the choice, draw the line, build the boundary, choose yourself, and watch what happens when you finally stop performing for people who are never going to clap anyway. And if you want to see more stories like this, stories about people who refused to stay broken, who fought back, who won, check out the other videos on this channel. Subscribe if you haven't. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because we're building something here. A community of people who understand that family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses you back. And that understanding, that truth, that's what actually sets you free.